Right. Hi, both of you, and thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. Maybe we could start by you telling us a little bit about Go Sheng, where it started from, why, and so on.
Nyambura, I don't know whether you've heard of the common phrase that the dog ate my homework.
Haven't we all?
So that's where the story of Go Sheng starts. That's where the story of Go Sheng starts. Danki was abroad, and he used to write snail mail to his friends back in Kenya to try and learn, and keep abreast of Sheng as it was growing, And back then, we didn't have email, we didn't have phones, mobile phones. So he was using snail mail, and he would keep a ledger with all the new words that his friends were sending him. Uh, hard copy. So he used to have a dog that he used to stay with when he was in India. And one day, I think he forgot to feed it, or it became agitated, and it came and ate up all his books, his manuscripts, and his Sheng dictionary. So he decided, hey, since I'm studying IT, why don't I just do a database, digital, and see how we can move on with it? And that's how Go Sheng was born. I think, Danki, you can elaborate on how far back that is.
Thanks, Gadu. Yes, that's a small portion of it. The history of it is that we weren't even going to be a formal entity because we weren't going the route of corporate, so to speak. The whole idea was for us or rather, it started with me collecting Sheng words in 1986. I was in standard 6 then. And I had a passion for Sheng because the flair and the floweriness with which we'd communicate back in the day always got me curious to know where some of these words came from. And so I started documenting, collecting the words when I was in standard 6. So when I left the country, I went to India for my studies. Ingawa Gadu anaita abroad, sijasikianga watu wameenda upande wakiita abroad. Yeah, so
abroad ni ngambo, sio majuu peke yake.
Yeah, abroad ni mayolo, hizo zingine ni others. Yeah, so I did quite a bit in terms of the back and forth with snail mail as Gadu was sharing. And then later when we got access to internet, that was in 96, I did the first database. It was a very simple website, and most of my audience was guys who were in diaspora, specifically in Stato. Then after a while, it started spreading, and guys were like, oh, there's a new website. And guys started contributing. And the good thing is that back in the day, so many people missed the ability to catch up with new words. And so the site made perfect sense for so many people. So what ended up happening was that in 97, I did the database, redid the database because of now new technology in the web space. And I was able to now start signing guys on and collecting email addresses, getting people's stories, just doing the structure of the thing. Came back in 99. We did about 8 years. I was working with some guys, Kinagadu included. And then around 2009, Ford got wind of what we were doing, and they're like, no, you can't do this off your pocket, because we were doing this off pocket. And they're like, Apana, we are going to get you support, and you guys had better get organized. And that's how Go Sheng was born in 2009. So we became a formal entity, registered with GAVA, put up structures, had a board, had a team. We were about 16 guys then, girls and boys, that is. And we went about our work, in brief.
Wow, that's a really interesting origin story. You know, we always want to know where things started, and that's pretty cool. What would you say is the role of language within this no direct flight film season? I've seen some of the stuff you're doing on social media with, I wouldn't even say translation, more like transliteration of some of these ideas that are circulating off of the film festival. So maybe talk to us a little bit about the role of Go Sheng within the context of no direct flight.
I say we're more than happy to be part of this conversation, simply because we feel Sheng has no limits into whatever space they can get into, right? And being the people that are not really tasked, but who document Sheng as it changes, we feel it's about time that we got not just into the film space, but driving the conversations forward in a language or in a space that people are most comfortable, using. For example, whenever you talk about, say, human rights or anything, that pertains to to us as people, people will always use a language they're most comfortable in. You'll never see people using strictly English or Swahili, per se. They always move to Swanglish, a more relaxed manner. And Sheng is here to do just that, especially now that we're dealing with film.
Let's talk a little bit about, as you're saying, what Sheng is here to do, because I'm interested in archives and archival practices, and that's part of what Danki was talking about. Like, in a sense, he was actively archiving, the Sheng moment during his snail mail and website and the early days of the website, and that's the work you continue to do. So maybe talk to us a little bit about the role of Sheng in archiving a particular, Kenyan or Nairobi moment, like capturing the spirit of the city or the country, the role Sheng plays in that regard.
When it comes to language, even the English that we speak right now has gone through what Sheng is going through now, only that it happened a long time ago, right? So we're very fortunate right now. We're here to document it as it changes, as it grows, as it spreads, not just from Eastlands, since it was born in Eastlands, to every corner of, let's say, Kenya and, across our borders as well. We have technology that is here to work for us, we didn't have people who were there to write and say this word came from this maybe ethnic community or from this country back in the day. But right now we have that unique opportunity, and we want to capitalize on this so that future generations are able to understand, just because you're using this word, where did it come from? Because just like, Sheng borrows from a multitude of local languages, and not just local as well, even international ones as well, from French, Somali, all these languages. And it would be very interesting for future generations to understand that Sheng is here to unite all these ethnic communities, all these languages into one laid back culture.
Danki, is there something you wanted to add?
Well, no. I think the interesting thing, even as we talk about archiving and following the journey of Sheng, everybody seems to have their view of what they think the history of the language is. And several people have done research. There's tons of studies with regard to where this came from. And it's interesting to note that their studies are nowhere near what our body of work has been to date. We've trailed these words based on their time periods, etymology that has a tag of the time. And that time is interesting because as Gadhu was listing the languages, when he talks about Somali, he talks about French, English, Spanish, Lingala, and all those. It's interesting that something like Somali language, some words started creeping in after 90, after Somali, the country disintegrated and we started getting immigrants. When you look at the early Sheng, a lot of it was Luo prefixed with lots of words, if not most words, having O as a prefix. Then later, late 90s, when the other informal settlements crop up, you have Kawangware, you have Kangemi coming up. Then you find the same words which were O prefix are now U prefix, because in Kikuyu, you don't have the O sound. It's a U sound, but I mean, it's a U in the letter, but the sound is an O. So following that journey is interesting, because when you ask, with reference to NDF, what does that mean? For us, if we watch a movie and we listen to whatever Sheng beats the movie has, we're able to tell you this movie was either written by a person this old, or a person that lives in this place, or a person who was targeting people from this specific geographical region, or a certain age set. So in the context of NDF, because it's film and it's film in Kenya, you almost invariably cannot escape having to use and buttress your work with Sheng.
Mm-hmm. And that's curious, because one of the things I've been thinking about and I wanted to ask you both was the place of Sheng within the realm of filmmaking and also film appreciation. You know, for instance, there are probably new audiences that are going to come to NDF off of your work as part of this film season, but also, you know, yeah, is there a filmmaking scene that's happening in Sheng, or is Sheng a thing that is a is at play within films, but not at the center of film, if that makes sense? You know what I'm saying? Like the way you would watch a film entirely in French or something like that. Is there a filmmaking scene? And if so, you know, what does that look like?
Okay, thanks, Nyambura. That's a very interesting point. If you look at, let's say, local productions from Akina Machachari, you know, all these plays and movies and series that, you know, are being broadcast locally, yeah? You can be sure that whenever they're doing their recording, no one speaks in straight English or, you know, English straight the whole time. Neither do they do proper Swahili. They'll always call each other, "Hey, Nani, chunga your mic." You know, they'll always use Sheng. Sheng will always hold this this industry because it's relaxed. If I'm sure if you're to go to a film set and they're talking in English and it's proper English, there's no it won't be there, and you'll feel very awkward if that is to happen. So just like I said, Sheng provides a platform that is not just relaxed, but you can share with your peers, all right? I'm sure if we get to a point where parliament is being done in Sheng, because of the generations that are going to be involved, many people will tend to understand what is going on or even follow the proceedings better, as opposed to when they're just speaking in legalese or even just straight up English.
But I still want to drill down on that question and ask, is there filmmaking in Sheng, or is there, you know, a scene? Because one of the things, if you remember in a previous conversation, was me wondering if, say, something like all these videos being shot, Gengeton videos being shot, for instance, can be thought of as Sheng filmmaking. You know, so I'm curious about that. If, you know, and especially because, as Danki pointed out, the language is constantly evolving. It's really dynamic. It's also, as he pointed out, like very location specific and so on. I mean, as I think anyone who's lived in Nairobi long enough or understands a little Sheng will recognize that you'll know someone's neighborhood by some of the words they'll use or some of their turns of phrase or something like that. And so I'm curious about whether, you know, there is a scene, or if anything can be considered a Sheng filmmaking scene in the same way, and like exclusively or like majority Sheng filmmaking scene.
I'll take that one. There's definitely tons of work going on, especially now that technology has allowed everybody and their grandmother to be producers. And what has ended up happening is that every single day there's either a movie or a song or some skit that's been done. And if you look at the bulk of what is known as Kenyan content online, even on YouTube, very easily, I mean, even the slay queens and slay kings, they try English, but that's not their first language, so they always fall back to Sheng. The scene exists, but it's not formal, it's not structured, so you wouldn't have a place where you can go and say, I'm going to Alliance Française of Sheng, for example. National Theatre would have been it for Sheng, but then again, National Theatre shares multiple users or audiences. Therefore, it's very hard to pin it down to just one specific place. I think that also is because of the fact that the bulk of people that speak Sheng as a first language come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and where they get the opportunity to make it, they move on across the other side of Uhuru Highway, and they pretty much just tie their roots in bits and pieces of PR events where they say, oh, I've gone back to where I came from, but then that's about it. But the scene does exist, just not formal, not formally recognized, if I may say.
And I'm interested in this notion of, the class element of Sheng and its place in like the Kenyan imagination, especially with regards to, as I said, which audiences you hope to attract to NDF off of the work you're doing. Like, do you imagine there'll be a new audience coming to these films because of the work you're doing, or are you tapping into your existing audience? Because the thing I've seen traditionally is that a lot of these film events will be very Anglo, like lots of English, and the films, if they're subtitled, will be subtitled in English and so on. So it's like English is the medium of film and film appreciation in Nairobi and in Kenya generally. So I'm curious about which new audiences you imagine are going to be coming to the festival of the work you're doing.
Interesting comment there. Interesting, because if you look at the bulk of like Gadu was enumerating, you have your Papa Shirandula, you have Mwala, Maria, all these local productions which are really, really, really immensely popular. You'll find that the characters that are assigned non-Anglo parts of the script or the plays will always speak to you in Sheng, and you will always speak to them in English, but they understand you. So that brings an interesting thing. We've always told guys there'd be no Sheng without English. And the truth of it is that because of our education system and the age of Sheng as a language, having been born in the 50s, late 40s, early 50s, you find Kenya as a country followed the British order, and therefore school was compulsory, even in our days. In fact, in our days, it was stricter. There was no way you'd be found on the streets. It was called truancy. You are not allowed to skip classes. You'd be taken in and it would be a big issue for you. So because of that, everybody has gone through the formal education system. Whether they finish fourth or not is neither here nor there, but they do know English as a language. They can read it, they understand it, and that's why you find in the plays where they depict, back to your question of class, in the plays where they depict a person as being of a certain class, being rich, they'll speak in English, but their workers will speak to them in Sheng. And somehow the worker understands English and the rich guy understands Sheng. So that brings an interesting question. Why are they speaking two different languages and still communicating? Why don't they all stick to Sheng or all stick to to English for that matter. It goes in a way to explain stroke, attempt to understand the audience you're talking about, the audience that would be ideal for the festival. It's generally anyone that lives in Kenya, probably Nairobi to a larger extent, because Nairobi has a different way of seeing life. It becomes hard to pin down a certain audience or region or class as having come to NDF as a result of our work. I'm not sure I would say there'd be an audience that has come specifically because of the Sheng. They come because of the film. They come because of the content of what they're expecting to see. Hearing is an augmentation. It's a bonus to the thing. They could watch a whole movie that is a silent movie and they'd be fine. But then when you add language, then it simply causes affiliation. It causes people to then identify. You're like, okay, I know this, I understand that, I can relate with this, that, or the other word. Yeah.
How do people come to, I mean, like we've talked a little bit about how people come to your work, but I'm interested in how people can build on this archive you're building. Like, is there a way for someone who comes upon your work to contribute to the lexicon, or do you have a team that's dedicated to building this lexicon, so you're just actively observing this? And I ask this as someone who's really interested in linguistics. I'm always wondering how, like how do lexicographers get to the point where they're like, this word is going to be added to the dictionary, or this word is worthy of our attention. You know what I'm saying? So how do people come to your work? How do people augment your work? Or is it a process that's like, I don't want to say top down, but you know what I'm saying? Like, is the work you're doing crowdsourced,
Yes. Majority of the words currently are crowdsourced, simply because we don't have the presence in all the hoods, and we're working with a skeleton crew, right? So we have like a formula that we use, which is of course set internationally. For a word to be recognized, there has to be a certain number of people that recognize it as a word, and that's what we have. Currently, we have it set at just 10 people. So let's say Nyambura comes onto our platform and says, I have this new word. So we'll only ask you to give the word, the meaning, and the who that it comes from, right? But at the same time, you also have to share it with 10 of your friends, or rather 9 of your friends, who will vote for this word. And then from the back end, we'll be able to see that Nyambura's friends have contributed to this. They've liked or, not liked the word. And based on the etymology you've given us, we'll put it in as a word. Yep.
I'm interested also in what your position is on, the place of local languages, and Danki pointing out that Sheng is essentially the lingua franca of Nairobi, even if it's not recognized as such. Like, on a person-to-person basis, people recognize it as the lingua franca of the city. So what's the place of, such languages within digital spaces? Because this is a continuing conversation. Are you in the sort of position where you imagine a future in which you can use a browser in Sheng, or you can, navigate the internet in Sheng, or have Sheng as a standard language option in the different places you're going to? Because I think increasingly I find that having a language present in digital spaces is one of the ways in which a language stays alive, for in this age. So I'm curious about that. What's a place of Sheng in these digital spaces, and in the structure of the digital spaces, not just as a thing, as a language in which people speak to each other.
Interesting question. We've over the years attempted to partner or donate our time and expertise to several efforts, one of which is Firefox. Unfortunately, they follow the ISO language format, and Sheng isn't an ISO language. Therefore, the larger players are not interested in translating to something that they find can't be standardized, because ISO is about standardization. We did apply to have Sheng recognized as an ISO language. It went through a whole process. We had a whole army of professors from Stato, UK, and ourselves from here. But that effort failed. Simply because there's not enough documented work to explain what exactly this thing is. That said, though, the blame would fall squarely on our laps, in the sense that as a country that is known for everything M or everything E, it's sad and unfortunate that most of our developers have largely focused on commercial projects. There are very few social projects. The work we continue to do, as we shared earlier, before us being made into a formal entity, the work we've continued to do has largely remained social in nature. Not even largely, it's like 99% social in nature. It's only during that brief stint that we got support from Ford Foundation that there was a bit of a corporate commercial element to us, where then now sustainability was an issue, being formal was an issue, because you have to appear for meetings, you have to appear for all these engagements with potential partners, and it becomes a challenge to get someone that can go the full distance on a social model. For Sheng to find itself in MS Word, in your browser, in Excel, and all those things, you require the help of the big boys. But then the big boys are not interested in social good projects. So it becomes a bit of a challenge. But that doesn't mean that you can't get Sheng in other spaces that we have better control. The funny thing, to an addendum to that problem or situation, is the fact that, number one, Kenyans don't like reading. Forget Sheng, they just don't like reading at all anyway. If you move that a bit, you move the needle a bit, it gets worse, because now in the age of Twitter with what used to be 140 characters, people's attention span is even worse now. So they only want snippets. And that's why you find the likes of TikTok and Instagram have become popular, because I don't want to read. I want to see and hear, and I disengage. So again, that becomes an interesting place that many languages, not just Sheng, many languages find themselves in. And then the other thing is textese has also become an issue. There's a whole new language emerging in all languages of the world, whether it's in English, it's in Zheng, in Kyuk, in Swa. The younger guys have come up with all these abbreviations of abbreviations. And it becomes complicated to understand what it is some of them are saying. That's a whole new space on its own. And that's why for us, when we talk about the work that we do, we remind the audience, we remind our visitors that for us, we are simply documenting, archiving, demystifying the language called Sheng. Whatever it will become in the next 5, 10, 15 years, we absolutely don't know. Then just to touch a bit on what Gathu talked about, the bulk of our words are crowdsourced. There's a huge engine behind the scenes that does the management of all of those verification and authentication of those words. Because the reality of Sheng is that in a family of 7, you can easily come up with a whole slew of words that only the 7 of you understand in your family. But then the moment you get out of your house, play with the other kids, share the words slowly spread. 20, 30 years ago, the bees that carried the pollen were the boarding schools, where Nairobi boys and girls would go to up-country schools and spread the Sheng words from Nairobi. Later in the 80s, late 80s into the 90s and a fair portion of 2000, the Bs became the Matatus. The Makangas are the ones who would exchange the words from town to their estate, from their estate to town. Then after the advent of FM, radio stations became the bees that carried the pollen being the words. And recently in the 2010s onwards, the bees now are the musicians and the comedians through their YouTube, TikTok, and what have you channels. A lot of words, a good example would be like the Mbogi Genje crew. They come up with all these new words and guys are like, what does that mean? What does that mean? Some words don't catch on, many words catch on. The ones that don't catch on simply fail and die away. But then you see, that's now where we come in, because we need to remind you that that word existed at some point in time. Just the same way we don't use the word like thou, we don't say wouldest, we don't say ye. So the work that we do ensures that those words don't get forgotten.
It's so refreshing to think of these crews like Kinabongi Genja and stuff as essentially, like the Shakespeare of Sheng, because like there's a lot of innovation going on, and some like especially innovation, which is what you're saying, and we are seeing it sort of happening in real time, and it's such valuable work you do to like memorialize the moment, and for us to be able to go back and be like, this thing was the thing in 2020. And you touched on this earlier, but I'm still going to ask because I want to hear like a straightish answer. But what do you think is the future of Sheng? I know you said you don't have a crystal ball. You didn't use those exact words, but you essentially said you don't have a crystal ball and you can't tell us where Sheng will be in 5 or 10 years. But I'd like to hear where you think Sheng will be in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years, especially because, especially in your case, Danki, you have decades of experience thinking about this language, observing it, and so on. And I'd be curious to know where you see it going, off of all of this information you bring into, you and your organization bring into, the study and knowledge of Sheng.
Well, the answer is very simple. So long as they are speakers of a language, the language will exist. So as to the shape and form that the language may acquire, whether formal or informal, remains really to the system. But the reality is that so long as there are people that speak that language, you're guaranteed to have the language exist for as long as those people will exist. The beauty of the situation is that a lot of what would have been a problem yesterday is no longer a problem today, for the simple reason that whereas there were barriers, to get to town, in our days, we used to walk to Tao in the 80s. Tao, we were raised in South B. Tao wasn't far, and it was funky to walk anyway. Well, obviously, climate was also an issue. The temperature wasn't the same as it is today. And so it was possible to walk from South B to Ngara and back. That barrier was because of money. Like, you didn't have 10 bob sitting there for you to go to Tao. Well, you had 10 bob to go to Tao for you to play at Pop-In, the games arcade, but then you didn't have 10 bob for you to go, roaming in Tao. That said, the reality is that new words will come. More of that Sheng will be used. A good example, as Gadu had touched on earlier, you go to a newsroom. The news is in itself collected in Sheng. The cameraman speaks Sheng. The news anchor or the news reporter speaks Sheng. Then they only format it to English or Swahili for whatever news segment it is that they do. Even up to the studio as you watch TV live, I can guarantee you in the reporter's ear, because they have their earpieces and all, the director speaks to them in Sheng. So the depth to which that has gone cannot be reversed. It can only grow more and spread wider. Another example is in schools. Some schools insist, oh, kids should not speak in Sheng. But go to the staff room. The teachers talk to each other in Sheng. When they are in the corridors, they speak to the kids in Sheng. When the headmaster shows up is when they pretend that they are, putting down Sheng. So it'll keep growing. The rate and breadth and depth may vary from place to place, but truth of the matter is that it will indeed keep growing.
Gadu?
Just to add just a bit on what Dankia said. Yes, Sheng is going to go far. A few years back, having a Sheng ad would have been, a dream. Right now we have it, and it's happening. We have billboards, in Sheng, and not just in Nairobi, but even up country, right? We have musicians coming to collaborate with our own, and they are even learning Sheng words, so they could throw them into their, their song. So definitely, in a couple of years, we're going to have more and more people embrace it. Hopefully, we're going to get to a part where even policy is being drawn using Sheng. As it is right now, it's normally done in legalese, then watered down into English, then translated into Swahili. And yet we claim that we're a Swahili nation, and we're not. Hopefully, just like I said, we're going to get to a point where everyone is comfortable using Sheng, and majority of what we want to disseminate, even to the larger populace, will be done in Sheng.
That sounds like a bright future for the language, and I look forward to whatever form its evolution takes. And I'm so happy we were able to have this conversation today. You guys are doing amazing work, and it's always great to talk to language nerds. So yeah, thank you so much for making time. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Nyambura. We
All right,
appreciate
you too.
the call.
You too.